The next stage in beef cattle production is the finisher or the large feedlot. And if you hear about beef cattle production in popular news, they're usually talking about issues related to large feedlots. So there are significant economies of scale in the finishing business. So we have seen consolidation in this part of the industry. And it turns out that currently feedlots that feed more than 1,000 head in the whole lot finish more than 80% of the fed cattle that we produce. So we have this situation in beef cattle production where at the beginning of the life cycle, when the calves are born, the industry is very distributed with many small producers, and that's just the typical cow-calf producer is holding a relatively small number of head. And then at each stage of the production cycle, it gets a little bit more aggregated. So it's very distributed in the cow-calf operations. The backgrounder feeders are pretty distributed. There's still quite a few of them, but not as many as the cow-calf producers. And the backgrounder will be able to handle several hundred of calves at a time fairly easily, would be pretty common. But when it gets to finishing feedlots, there tends to be a few very large feedlots that actually finish the calves. So what do the calves look like when they come to a feedlot? So when the calves come to the feedlot for finishing, they're typically already 12 to 18 months old, and they weigh 700 to 900 pounds. And the finisher is going to keep them for 3 to 6 months, depending on prices and incentives to keep them, or go ahead and send them to the slaughter market. And they'll spend that time eating a diet of grain, mostly corn, some soybeans, some other stuff, and hay. And when they're at the finisher's feedlot, they're going to be gaining about 2.5 to 4 pounds per day, and typically convert about 6 pounds of feed into 1 pound of weight gain. So since these large feedlots are handling so many animals, they have their operation divided into much smaller pens, and typically they'll have about 100 to 125 animals per pen, and that helps them isolate diseases. So if all of the calves were mingling in one giant pen, if a disease hits the feedlot, all the calves are going to get sick. But if they're in smaller pens, then if a disease strikes a pen, maybe all 100 animals in the pen will be stricken by the disease, but not all 1,000. And those animals can be isolated further from the rest of the herd that's in the feedlot so that they don't spread the disease. And also, as you can imagine, the large feedlot is kind of a smelly business because all of those animals are producing a lot of waste. And all of the large feedlots have a big digester ponds where the waste is rounded up and put into the digester pond. And once it's in there, the microorganisms can do their thing, and they break down the toxins before they can leach into the local water supply. The other thing that has come to be common in the industry is that the big beef packing plants are located very near the big feedlots. And that makes sense because it makes it much cheaper to transport those fattened cows to the place where they'll be ultimately slaughtered into the meat packing plant. So let's take a look at some feedlots via satellite because you can actually see them on Google Earth. So in this area of western Kansas, there's an awful lot of large feedlots. So I'm going to zoom in here to the Garden City area. I'm going to switch over to Google Earth, and we're going to see if we can't find some big feedlots. So again, this is Garden City, Kansas, and I'm just going to scroll around here till I see something. This is a feedlot, and you can see it's right outside of town in Garden City. If you zoom in, you can actually see the animals there. So these are the smaller pens that have 100 to 125 animals in them, and you can see the digester ponds where they put the waste into. And they've got feed silos here where they keep the corn and other feedstuffs. And then this is probably silage covered in tarps, if I had to guess. It looks like there's a tarp covering some stuff. It's possible that's grain silage or maybe distillers grains or something, but they've got it covered with, and then covered with a tarp, and then the tarp's weighed down with a bunch of tires. The other thing to note is that you see a bunch of circles. Those are pivot irrigation fields. So this part of the state sits right over top of the Ogallala aquifer. And so there's plentiful groundwater for irrigating crops. So this part of Kansas produces really large corn yields routinely because of the access to the underground water. We just looked at this feedlot. You can see there's some more over here. Zoom in, then we'll see the same thing. There's the cattle pens, and here's sort of where they work the pens. They can see, separate them into even smaller groups here where they can administer medicine or other kinds of anything that they need to handle the cattle for. They can put them into those smaller pens. And in this part of Kansas, you can find these feed yards just all over the place. I'm guessing there's one there. Indeed, that looks like a pretty big one. Garden City feed yard. Here's another one. So as you can see, there's just thousands and thousands of cattle on feed in this part of Kansas. You can find the same thing in Nebraska and some in Colorado. And I believe there's a packing plant around here. Yep. Outside of Garden City, here's a Tyson fresh meat plant. And so they're going to be packing beef out of this plant. And so, you know, these are the containers where the product will go out in, and then, you know, the workers' parking lot, whatever. Here's the facility. And then here's where the cows go into the plant. So they've got them in small pens, and then they run through this chute into the plant, and then that's where the packing happens. Another big feed yard over here. Okay, so I think we'll break here and then continue with the rest of the chapter in the next video.